this very valuable opportunity to listen to presentation by Jeffrey Schott. I've known him for quite a while, and of course he's the senior research fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. He joined that institute in 1983, and I understand that it was when the institute was established. 1981 established, I see. So you joined 2 years after the opening of the institute. You might know who the Peterson is. I heard that Mr. Peterson was the founder of the institute, right? And he has made a lot of contributions to establish and to make the institute globally, renowned for its very authoritative international economic policy. And Jeffrey, he studied at the Washington University at St. Louis. He graduated in 1971, so I think he's about the same age with me, but he looks very younger, much younger than me. And then he came to Washington, D.C. For his master's degree at SAIS, the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Before joining the institute, he worked in the U.S. Treasury Department until 1982 in the areas of international trade and energy policy. I just wonder how much he enjoyed working in the government. Ever since he joined the institute, he was digging deeply and broadly the issues relating to international trade policies, and also he's an expert on the economic sanctions. He wrote a book on economic sanctions also. And we know that Peterson Institute is the non-government research institute. But the policy recommendations and the policy suggestions are widely recognized and actually reflected in the actual formation of the U.S. international economic policy. But since the institute is a non-government institute, their research report is known to be very bipartisan. So I understand that Peterson Institute is one of the institutes in Washington, D.C., which follows bipartisan stance, not Democrats, not Republicans. So I heard that that's the reason why those fellows in the Peterson Institute are not given so much opportunities to work in the government because they are bipartisan. Am I true? Depends, I see. He has written many books, and most of the books are about the topics of the international trade. So he's really the expert, not only in academic analysis, but also in the developing the economic policies on international trade. So today, we are quite happy to have him here because now we are very concerned about the emerging of the trade protectionism, not only in U.S. but also in other countries. And we know that Jeffrey Schott and his institute are playing a very constructive role in educating the U.S. politicians, those politicians who are more inclined to trade protectionism. So on that point, we should appreciate him and the Peterson Institute. So let me invite Jeffrey Schott for his presentation. Let me welcome him.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. It is a great pleasure to be with you again, and I appreciate the generosity of Kita and the Institute for Global Economics in inviting me back. It's always a pleasure when I'm in Seoul to have the opportunity to meet with you in this type of an occasion, and I feel a strong kinship with the Institute for Global Economics, which was founded about 20 years ago, almost, when 16 years ago, when one of my colleagues, a visiting fellow at the Institute for International Economics, Dr. Sagong-il, returned after a brief visit in our institute and wanted to establish a similar type of institution here in Seoul. But we told him, you can't call it the Institute for International Economics, so he called it the Institute for Global Economics. And it shows that we are really family, that we come from the same source. And so I greatly appreciate the opportunity to work again with the Institute for Global Economics. I was asked today to make a few remarks about trade policy in the Obama administration. And I think very important to spell out a few things on what is going on in Washington so that there is a better understanding. In part because it was only about 1 year ago, in February of 2008, that Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton were arguing very aggressively about who would be more protectionist and whether they would withdraw from the North American Free Trade Agreement, from NAFTA. And those comments were listened to very carefully all over the world. And in the interim, there has been much less reporting about what is being said and done on trade. And the memories of a year ago are still very fresh in the minds of people when they think about U.S. policy. But let me say one thing very clearly. We are not in February 2008. The world has changed very dramatically since then, and those changes have had a very big influence on U.S. policy. And the election of Barack Obama and the appointment of Mrs. Clinton as Secretary of State, who just visited here last week, I think indicate a dramatic change from the discussions the two had when they were vying for the nomination of their party. There's a big difference when you are campaigning for the selection among your own party and when you have responsibility for governing a great country. And I think that is part of the reason why there is a new sense of urgency in the United States engaging with its trading partners. And I hope that Secretary Clinton gave that message to both Korean government officials and the Korean people during her visit here last week. Now, it's important in describing U.S. trade policy to make one thing clear. There has to be an understanding of who is shaping U.S. trade policy before you can understand what is shaping trade policy and where it is likely to go. And in the United States, even though we now have a president from the Democratic Party and leaders in Congress from that party with very large majorities, there is a tension because in the Congress, which has constitutional responsibility for trade, there are a growing caucus of new members that were elected on platforms that were very skeptical of trade, of increasing trade liberalization. And those Democrats, particularly in the House of Representatives, do not necessarily share the views of the more centrist and international-minded Obama administration. And so in dealing with the Congress, which will want to continue to pursue narrower constituent interests from labor unions and Rust Belt industries, the Obama administration will have to be very careful and very diplomatic and make compromises. And that, I think, is one of the biggest challenges for President Obama, is not in working with the opposition, but working with elements of his own party. Now, what is shaping U.S. policy? If you listen to the priorities, or look at the priorities of the Obama administration coming in, you would see a very clear focus on domestic policy, reforming various domestic programs, but most of all, trying to revive the U.S. economy from a very deep recession. There is concern about health care and strengthening the social safety net, which is quite weak in the United States and gives great anxiety to workers if they lose their job, have inadequate health care, or have less than adequate pensions. And so these are all big challenges that President Obama wanted to face in coming into office. Trade was not a top priority. In fact, probably was not in the top 10 of the priorities of his administration. But as the Obama administration already discovered in the debate over the economic stimulus package in the U.S. Congress, which included Buy American provisions, it is very difficult to separate domestic policies from their international implications. And indeed, if you had asked a body of experts 6 months ago what the trade policy of the Obama administration would be, no one would have said that the first trade policy issue that would be addressed by the Obama administration would be government procurement policies and Buy American policies in domestic law. And in fact, I can assure you that is true, because I participated 6 months ago in the drafting of a memo to the president, next president, by a group of experts and former cabinet members from both parties, including people like Carla Hills, former USTR, Clayton Yiter, former USTR, Stuart Eisenstadt, top Democratic official in several governments, Fred Bergston, my colleague. But all of these great men and women, and with their great experience, no one considered Buy American would be the issue that started to frame U.S. policy on trade. And indeed, when I got a call from the White House a few weeks ago asking what our advice would be on the Buy American provisions in the U.S. legislation, we worked all weekend to send some advice to ensure that the first actions taken by the Obama administration would not send the wrong signal to our trading partners. And it was very gratifying that the following week, President Obama came out with a very clear statement that what was critical for the United States was to be able to work with our trading partners and ensure that we develop a multilateral approach to resolving the global economic crisis. And in that way, he said it would be a mistake to pursue new protectionist policies, and and the White House then worked with the Senate to try to modify the provisions on Buy America. They weren't able to remove them because of the strong interest in those provisions in the Democratic caucus, but they were able to add provisions that those provisions would only be implemented consistent with U.S. international trade obligations. And so that was the first story in the trade policy of the Obama administration. And what will follow? I think in many ways the trade policy agenda will be dictated by non-trade events and non-trade considerations. And when I raised the question, what is shaping U.S. trade policy, I think it will be dominated by much broader strategic concerns. First is the perception of the United States in the international community. And President Obama made it very clear during the campaign and has said since becoming president that it is important for the United States to again embrace multilateral approaches to global economic problems. And so he will face a challenge to craft a multilateral approach to the global economic crisis. And in this realm, I should note that he has a wonderful ally in Korea and working in the G20. And Dr. Sogong, when he was in Washington a few weeks ago, met with the leaders in the White House who are working on the G20. And it is clear that the priorities that Dr. Sogong has are fully shared by the Obama administration in trying to seek a very strong result out of the G20 summit in London on April 2nd. The fact that the United States and Korea are working so closely together in this venture, the fact that Korea is one of the leaders of the G20 as part of the leadership troika and will chair the G20 process next year, I think is very encouraging for the world economy and will be very helpful in deepening U.S.-Korean economic ties going forward because none of the problems we have in trade will be easily resolved if we continue to have the deep economic problems that the United States and other countries now face. And so working together on economic recovery is essential, and having such a strong partner as Korea is incredibly valuable for the United States. The second point on strategic interests that will shape U.S. trade policy are foreign policy concerns. Here it is very clear that no matter how various domestic constituencies feel about international trade or trade agreements, that U.S. foreign policy and security interests are overwhelmingly important with our key trading partners. And that, I think, will temper the way the United States treats China. It will also have, of course, a very important consequence for the deliberations on U.S.-Korea trade. And I think you saw the beginning of that recognition and sophistication in U.S. policy when Secretary Clinton was here last week. And I think there will be a very positive influence on the trade policy considerations from the overall because of the overall importance of the U.S.-Korea bilateral relationship. I'll say a few words more about the Chorus FTA in a few moments. Next, trade policy will also be affected by the trade implications of domestic recovery plans, and particularly in the auto sector. If one looks at what major trading countries are doing to support their domestic auto industries and the potential for discrimination and distortions in trade and investment, this will be an element that has to be considered, and that trade policy will hopefully temper the more protectionist instincts that have already arisen very strongly in Europe, in French policy and others, and have been vetted as well in the U.S. Congress when considering the bailout or restructuring of General Motors and Chrysler. And that saga is still being worked out, but it will have implications for U.S.-Korea trade relations because each country has substantial investments in the auto sector of the other. And how we treat our auto companies may affect the role of foreign subsidiaries in our country. So it's a very important issue and one that will have a high profile going forward this year. And last but not least, one of the broader strategic interests that will, I think, in the future possibly even dominate trade policy is one that has very high priority in the Obama administration, and that is the need to develop a post-Kyoto global climate change regime. It is an issue where the environmental objectives are critical, and where the tensions between achieving those objectives and meeting the competitiveness concerns of local industry create a great tension. And particularly at a time of economic stress, when you already have declining employment, the thought that new carbon taxes or regulatory mandates may further impede the competitiveness of domestic industries will lead governments, not just in the United States, but everywhere, to consider programs that support domestic industry and discriminate against foreign suppliers or imports through border taxes or other means. This is already beginning to surface. The European Union has been discussing such measures against dirty American imports for several years. No action has been taken, but these types of concerns, using exceptions in the World Trading Rules under Article 20, which for GATT WTO experts is an article that provides general exceptions for a number of reasons, including environmental, public health and safety concerns. Those types of measures could become legal under the WTO and provide a channel for a rollback of a lot of the liberalization that we have seen over the past few decades. It's a very serious issue, and one in which could be damaging if not given adequate attention by national governments when they are framing their environmental policies and their trade policies. This also is the opportunity, however, for trade policy to move in a very constructive agenda. Because, to take the U.S.-Korea example, while there are some concerns among members of Congress about provisions relating to autos in the Chorus FTA, when one compares those concerns to the broader concerns about climate change, they seem very small. And the fact that Korea and the United States are working together in this area, I think will provide a very constructive channel for finding a political solution to a number of the more specific trade issues that have been part of the bilateral commercial relationship for some time. This is also true in the North American context, where President Obama during the campaign, as I said, even threatened to withdraw from NAFTA at one inopportune moment in the primary debates. He now sees that NAFTA can be an opportunity and that there is advantage in upgrading trade agreements to expand the scope of bilateral cooperation to new areas like climate change, concerns about border security, and energy security. And I think in that context, when there are issues that both countries will benefit tremendously from by working together, then the smaller disputes, though seemingly intractable in the past, are put in a different context and are more likely to be resolved amid this broader constructive discussion. I can discuss this more in detail if you have questions about it. But I think this is an area where we will see positive influence on trade policy going forward. Now, what will be U.S. priorities for trade negotiations? Members of Congress basically allowed the President's Trade Promotion Authority to expire almost 2 years ago. In fact, right after the signing of the Chorus FTA. And there's little likelihood that that authority will be renewed in the very near term, in part because there are few new opportunities for bilateral trade negotiations going forward. If one looks at U.S. FTA policy, free trade agreement policy, the list of countries that want to negotiate with the United States is now very small. We have had a policy that has run its course, and the countries that continue to be interested in dealing with the United States basically want a political deal to enhance the political relationship, and I think that will probably be dealt with through other means. But the one negotiation that I think the Obama administration will give priority to is the Doha round. And I think for several reasons. First, as I said before, because of Obama's interest in bolstering multilateral initiatives and ensuring the viability of the multilateral negotiating process. If the Doha round was allowed to fail, it would be the first failed negotiation in the post-war history of the world trading system. I think it would it would deal a terrible blow to the multilateral trading system and severely undercut the ability to use the multilateral forum for negotiations in the future. If one went through all of the work and almost a decade of effort to try to achieve a result and ended up with nothing, I think many businessmen and government officials would question whether it was worth the investment in trying to do it again. And so completing the Doha round, reaping the benefits of the modest but nonetheless important results that can be achieved, I think is critical. It's also critical because the symbolic importance of having a viable WTO negotiation as part of the trade response to the global economic crisis is crucial. If talks were allowed to fail, it would almost send a signal that governments didn't care that much about holding the line against new protectionism, and we're going to follow more of a go it alone and protect your own or beggar thy neighbor policy that we've already begun to see surface in some of the policies of the major trading nations. Now, there has been some concern, particularly in the U.S. business community, that there's not much on the table in Geneva. And they say that a Geneva agreement is not valuable unless it creates new liberalization in the areas of agriculture, manufacturers, and services. That's a very good position to take, but I think it underestimates the value of maintaining the current level of openness, because many countries have unilaterally reduced their trade barriers over the past 15 or 20 years, but have not made a legal obligation to maintain that in the WTO. As a result, the WTO actually allows new protectionism. It is legal under the WTO to raise tariffs for many countries, to impose all sorts of trade restrictions that distort commerce and investment, and countries are beginning to do that. I think what the simple point here is that if we have a failed Doha round, we don't continue the status quo. That isn't sustainable. If we don't have a forward progress in the Doha round, we're likely to see a trading system that is much more restrictive with many more obstacles to trade and investment. And of course, that would not be good news for the United States or for Korea. One final reason that the politicians in the audience will appreciate, pushing for the Doha negotiations now does not mean that you have to spend political capital now to change policies. It means that you have to establish a process, allow the negotiators to negotiate, so that political decisions can be taken probably next year on whether to change policies in sensitive industries and service sectors in order to achieve the final deal. It will take almost a year to get to the final stages of the negotiations. And in the meantime, we hope that the world economy will have hit bottom and begun to recover. It is very difficult to conclude trade negotiations at a time of economic distress. But once countries begin to move back into a positive growth and there is more optimism, it is easier for politicians to say, we're going to make these changes to invest in our future. And that is essentially what the Doha round is. It is an investment in our future, and it's something that hopefully can pay dividends starting a year from now. I think for those reasons, because of the importance of extending a multilateral approach in international trade, the Obama administration will give priority to the Doha round. Bilateral negotiations will not receive much attention. The other area of interest will likely be in North America with the upgrading of NAFTA. In fact, I like that word so much, I'd even think we should think about an upgrading of the Chorus FTA. You know, it's been almost 2 years since negotiators shook hands on the Chorus FTA, April 2nd, 2007. And of course, a lot has changed, particularly in the auto sector. Big changes in both countries that I discussed before. And clearly, what I would advise to the new U.S. administration is to quietly sit down with the Korean government and discuss what each are doing. with regard to helping their domestic auto industry and the implications that has for the trade and investment interests of each other, and what each is doing to promote the growth and employment in their own countries, and how they may work together to bolster the global competitiveness of their industries through joint initiatives. This type of discussion, I think, is very important for partners to have, and may yield some ideas on how one can augment the already important provisions and agreements that have been reached to make sure that the Chorus FTA and U.S.-Korea bilateral initiatives meet the needs of our economy as it stands now in the face of very difficult economic times. Upgrade is a much nicer word, and renegotiate should be perhaps expunged from the diplomatic vocabulary. That, of course, introduces me to one of the more difficult problems that the Obama administration will have on trade policy, and that is dealing with unfinished business. I've already talked about the Doha round. That could be considered unfinished business, and that will get priority. But there is also unfinished business in ratifying 3 free trade agreements. The agreements concluded with Colombia, Panama, and, of course, Korea. And each one poses difficult problems. The least difficult is Panama, because the political problem that led to the delay in the ratification of Panama has been resolved. And there are a number of American companies who are interested in Panama because they're planning to dig a big hole, a new Panama Canal. And their companies, U.S. companies, would like to provide the equipment to dig that hole. And so I see that being completed sooner rather than later. Colombia provides a different challenge. Congressional concerns about Colombia do not involve provisions of the agreement, but the environment in which the agreement is implemented in Colombia. In particular, concerns about the murder of trade union leaders in Colombian society. And this is part of a broader problem of insurrection and drug trafficking in Colombian society that the Uribe government has been trying to expunge. That will require some political deal that involves processes in Colombia that would allow for greater greater prosecution of suspected criminals and murderers, and a greater transparency in the judicial process. It's a lot different than the situation in Korea with the Korea Agreement, where there is a small but vocal constituency in the Democratic Party that is concerned about the auto provisions. And that has led President Obama to voice their concerns and say that there was a need to fix the problem. If one looks at the trade and investment, one can see that the political debate has been somewhat distorted. But there is a clear political concern, which at a time of massive unemployment in the U.S. auto industry, and particularly the big three, and the restructuring of GM and Chrysler, make it very difficult to pursue a solution, both political and economic, until there's greater clarity on what will happen with the major U.S. automakers. So for that reason, I think there will be probably some delay in the consideration of the Chorus FTA by the U.S. Congress, at least in the first half of this year. The auto bailout program is still being elaborated, and the consequences of that will have to be pursued both in terms of the domestic implications and how it affects U.S. International relations. And I would think that once that is clarified, and with the growing recognition of how constructive Korean policy has been in working with the United States on the global financial crisis, that there will be a better atmosphere for pragmatic discussions in the second half of this year. Clearly, the President recognizes the critical importance of resolving this issue successfully so that the Chorus FTA can be implemented. Clearly, Chairman Rangel, one of the key officials in the Congress who will be responsible for the implementation of the agreement, wants to see the Congress say yes to the Chorus FTA. I can tell you very clearly it is inconceivable that the Congress would say no. The cost to the United States, the damage to our bilateral relationship would be too great. And so the question is, what can be done in terms of domestic U.S. politics to get the Congress to say yes? And I think this will be a task that the administration will take on probably in the second half of this year, and hopefully we'll be able to find some constructive approach so that the very good agreement that was signed in 2007 can be implemented so that both our countries can begin to reap the dividends of the hard work that was done and the opportunities that are there for both of us to benefit both our companies and our workers. I'd be happy to talk a bit more about that. Let me just note one final area where there may be initiatives on trade policy and with implications for Korea. One of the difficulties we have in implementing trade policy at a period of economic recession is that domestic industries and workers want to play defense and want to use the tools available in the trading system to limit competition so that they have an easier time adjusting to the demands of the more difficult conditions in the marketplace. And we were likely to see more anti-dumping petitions. We are likely to see more WTO complaints filed by U.S. government in Geneva. And many of these will be directed against China. That is part of the process, but it is also important, as Secretary Clinton discussed during her visit there last week as well, that there be a balance in the discussions and a maintenance of a constructive dialogue so that we can continue to work together in a wide area of issues of common concern. Climate change is critical. It is. I don't have to tell anyone in Seoul that there won't be a resolution of problems on greenhouse gas emissions unless China plays a major part in the solution. And the United States is the world's greatest emitter, will have to contribute substantially to ensure that China is a part of the solution as well. China is critical in discussions on North Korea, on dealing with Iran, and in other areas. So it is important to have some balance to the bilateral discussions, which at times will be contentious on trade, as they have been in the past. And there, the United States started working with an initiative that George Yeo thought up of more than a decade ago. Originally, and he introduced this, in fact, at our this idea at our institute in a speech in the 1990s. He said we should think about a P5, where countries that have common trading interests get together, begin to integrate more closely, and provide a core for other countries in the region to begin to join with us so that we can move towards the vision of free trade and investment in the Asia-Pacific region. I should note that in that speech, he said maybe P5 wasn't the right number. Maybe we should say P6 and include Korea. And that was in the early 1990s. Well, today, that argument is even more powerful than it was when he originally made that speech. And a small group of countries got together to form a P4 agreement. Singapore, New Zealand, Brunei, and Chile. And you think of those 4 countries, very nice countries, but very small. And so the reaction was, who cares? And the United States said, well, we'll start talking to you. And the Congress, which normally would be very critical of new trade initiatives, said, who cares? It's very small. But then other countries came and said, you know, there's some good ideas here, and we already have strong trade ties or trade agreements with these countries. So Australia is joining the discussions next month, and Vietnam has said that they want to participate, at least in the discussions. And other countries are beginning to consider it because they already have free trade agreements with Chile and Singapore or New Zealand. Who are those countries? Well, Mexico, Canada. Japan has free trade agreements with many of those countries as well. In fact, so does Korea. And so does China. China has a free trade agreement with Chile, with New Zealand, with Singapore. And so the thought that this could produce a new forum for interaction on a regional level, which would take into account the needs of East Asia and provide better understanding between countries on both sides of the Pacific, offers a very interesting opportunity for the Obama administration to take up the new initiative that has yet to be really framed, put its own mark on it, and use it as a basis for expanding regional cooperation. And I put that out not as something that has been fully elaborated, but as a potential that could serve as great interest for the United States and for Korea as we deepen our bilateral partnership, also to use that as scope for improving relations and opportunities in our broader neighborhood. So on that optimistic note, and I wanted to end a talk on U.S. trade policy on an optimistic note, and it's hard to do that sometimes, I want to thank you for your attention, and I would be very happy to answer your questions on whatever subject is of interest. Thank you very much.
Yesterday I read a newspaper which says that U.S. government will give subsidies to the buyers of new cars. I presume that it will apply to the cars made by American automakers in U.S., of course, but I wondered if it will apply to imported cars, and what about to, cars made by foreign manufacturers in America? Thank you.
that issue came up last month during the debate on the stimulus package. And in the House of Representatives, one member of Congress proposed giving a subsidy only to people who buy cars from GM and Chrysler and Ford. And Mazda made a statement and said, oh, by the way, that is illegal under the WTO. It is a blatant violation, and we will file a complaint, and you will be found guilty, and there will be retaliation. The congressman did not have a response to that. All the lawyers said, yes, Mazda was right, and the provision was dropped. I don't know what was being reported in the paper yesterday, but it could be that there is an interest in subsidizing the purchase of new cars. And this is why I mentioned the story of Buy American before, because as a result of the Buy American incident, President Obama made a very strong and clear statement that the U.S. will abide by its international trade obligations. So when these proposals come forward, the first test is it consistent with U.S. international trade obligations? Well, the only way such a provision can be consistent with WTO rules is if the subsidy is applied to all sales in the U.S. market. It cannot discriminate against imports. It cannot discriminate among producers in the United States. And so would it have to apply to someone buying a car from Hyundai produced in Alabama, or buying an imported Hyundai landing in Seattle or Los Angeles? And I think the concern is, how do you ensure that the entire infrastructure of the auto industry, not just the companies, but their parts suppliers and service suppliers, service providers across a wide range of activities in our economy, maintain a level of activity that allows them to survive the current downturn. And so in that sense, it might make sense to have that broad-based subsidy. But if you're subsidizing 10 million, 11 million sales, that can get expensive. Now, one idea that has been pursued in France and Germany is to provide subsidies for people who take old cars and highly polluting or very fuel inefficient cars, and scrap them, get rid of them, and buy a new car that is more fuel efficient, and that is an opportunity to replace the old fleet, create demand for new durable goods, and that's an idea worth investigating as well. But there are many ways in which people get around those rules for financial advantage, and so one has to construct that program very carefully.
Thank you, Mr. Schott, for your pertinent and timely presentation on the U.S. trade policy in Korea. My question is, in order to make WTO function and role more effective, don't you think it's necessary to reorganize or rearrange WTO to cope with or to resolve world trade expansion problems, which will be helpful and to alleviate global economic crisis and beneficial to both developed and developing countries, rather than protectionism? Will it not be more effective to change or shift WTO activities to new international trade organizations under the banner of United Nations Economic and Social Commission, ECOSOC? We appreciate your views on this issue. Making or converting international organization into UN organization?
I agreed with everything you said until the last sentence. It is very important for the WTO to play a constructive role in the current crisis and to restructure so that it better addresses the needs of international trade in the 21st century. On the first point, Pascal Lamy is working very closely with his counterparts in other international organizations and with national governments to do what the WTO can do to contribute to the multilateral solutions that are needed to get us out of this very deep economic hole. And I understand that he met with your president during his stay here and with other ministers, and will continue to be in close touch. I know he has had long meetings with Dr. Sagan about what the WTO can contribute to the G20 process, and I am trying to facilitate further discussions of that type. Clearly, if you look at the Doha Round agenda, it is the agenda of problems in the 20th century. It does not address many of the new challenges and opportunities that have arisen in the past decade. But if you do not complete the work of the Doha Round, as I mentioned earlier, it will be very difficult to get the political support for using the WTO or restructuring it to meet these new challenges, including climate change. And these new challenges will require the WTO to change the way it works and with whom it works. The way it works means there has to be institutional reform to bring in the views and expertise of other groups, including civil society, including parliamentarians that have a stake in what goes on in the development of international trade disciplines. But it means, importantly, it has to rearrange its institutional structure to work more closely with other institutions. Right now, on an informal basis, the WTO is working closely with the World Bank, with the IMF, with the International Labor Organization, with the OECD, with a number of other international institutions. Many of these linkages are built on strong personal relationships. And because the leaders of the organizations are very energetic, insightful, and have had past working ties. That's very good for now. It's a coincidence of the moment. And it needs to have, those relationships need to have an institutional structure so that when the next generation of leaders comes into these organizations, they don't have to rely on the coincidence of having a personal relationship, but rather can build on the work that has been done in the past by their institution so that there is a continuity in effort. And this is one of the reasons I believe that Pascal Lamy agreed to run for a second term as Director General of the WTO. I think he has a strong commitment to WTO reform to deal with the types of concerns that you raised. I am more concerned about your suggestion that the mandate be changed to become an agency of the UN system. Because the last thing we need is a bureaucratic overlay in organizations that have to respond more adroitly to rapidly changing conditions in world markets. And some of the old UN institutions just are bogged down by layers of bureaucracy. And reform is very difficult because of the large number of countries that have to be accommodated in any decision. The UN does have a trade organization in Geneva, the UNCTAD, headed by former Director General of the WTO, Dr. Subachai. And Dr. Subachai and Pascal Lamy work very closely together. And I would envisage, I was remiss in not mentioning UNCTAD in the list of organizations where there are close collaboration. But I would worry about linking the two organizations or merging the two organizations in a broader UN system. I think much better that there are closer institutional ties and formal arrangements between the WTO and select UN agencies that would bring the needed expertise to problems that are interrelated. One can't talk just about trade. One has to worry about the employment consequences. One has to worry about development concerns, about finance, not just trade finance, but the overall role of trade in development strategies. This requires a greater integration of work at the international level than we have seen so far. And I should also note, and this is a criticism of my own country, it requires a greater integration of policy at the national level. And too often, there have been bureaucratic firewalls between ministries or agencies of government that are trying to work on these big global problems. And one of the interesting things in the Obama administration is that he has set up a number of coordinating offices in the White House to integrate energy, environment, climate change, to deal with the problems of financial restructuring. And he has independent groups, such as one headed by Paul Volcker, to provide independent advice across a range of financial issues. So I think this is the future and direction for international agencies, and I hope it will also be echoed at the national level.
I'm going to take my privilege to sit here. One question is that you proposed several very constructive ideas about how to promote post-FTA ratification in those countries. And now the immediate issue in Korea is that there is a very sharp confrontation between the ruling party and the opposition party. And the ruling party, they claim that they want to ratify immediately, preferably in the incumbent session. And the opposition party argues that they want to wait until the implementation bill is proposed to submit it to the US Congress. So knowing this, if you are advisor to the Korea's National Assembly, what is your view in these two conflicting stances? Will the ratification or wait until the U.S. White House submits to the US Congress, which is more desirable strategy for Korea, and which is more productive conducive to promote the ratification of the U.S. Congress?
The strategy that is most useful for Korea to pursue or for the United States to pursue is the one that will achieve the greatest political support in your own country for moving forward with the trade agreement, but also importantly, perhaps even more importantly, pursuing the domestic policies that allow you to take full advantage of the trade agreement, which is why essentially you have this agreement, to encourage the type of policy reform that boosts productivity in your economy and creates more economic growth and employment. So there are a number of factors. But I think my advice to the National Assembly would be very simple, and that is do what is in the best interests of Korea and looking at the risks and opportunities in the political debate in Korea. There are a number of advantages in moving quickly. There are a number of advantages in having a more deliberate approach. There are risks in both sides. And one thing I have found in working on trade for the past 35 years is that when there is a delay, a number of things can happen that you didn't anticipate. And it doesn't have to be in trade. It can be a political event, some security event that distracts attention away from the legislative agenda. And so that would argue that when there is an opportune time to make progress, you should make progress. Also, delay provides an opportunity for further criticism in society because you're not getting the benefits of the agreement that have been promised. And so the critics can focus on the perceived adjustments without having to say that they are risking losing the gains that will come once the agreement is implemented. It's a one-way bet in that sense. We saw that in the United States when President Clinton delayed the ratification of the NAFTA. And during the 8 months in which we negotiated side agreements on labor and the environment, the opponents of the NAFTA had an open field to attack the agreement, and no one responded. So that would argue for action as soon as there was a good opportunity and the benefits greatly outweigh the risks. But the bottom line is this is a political decision in the context of Korean politics. And consideration of the United States should be secondary. Hopefully the United States Congress will have the same overall perspective of the Korean National Assembly, see the agreement as a highly valuable accord that is one piece of a very important bilateral relationship, and will agree to implement it as soon as possible. And I'm hoping that can be done in the second half of this year. I think the best we can do is create the atmosphere that makes it more amenable for congressional approval and in the United States. And I hope we will have at that time when the United States acts, I hope we will have a partner that firmly supports the agreement like we do.
My name is a journalist. This morning I watched TV on CNN that Mr. Bernanke predicted that the downturn in the U.S. business will end at the end of this year. And I'd like to know what's the opinions or predictions of economic experts there about the business cycle in America, and and I hope that American business will get well because bad economy in the U.S. has affected Korea very seriously.
Well, some of my colleagues have worked very closely with Mr. Bernanke in the past. Our deputy director co-authored a book with him on inflation targeting. So we are fairly close to his thinking. And I think his projections, those of the Fed, which have some of the most able economists in the country and who devote a lot of resources to their analysis, their projections are usually very credible. And they reflect now, I would say, the consensus view among U.S. economists that this current quarter is probably going to be the worst quarter we've had, and that we will have a gradual improvement, though weakening of the economy through the year, and a bottoming out towards the end of the year and recovery next year. The concern is that the recovery won't be as rapid as one would hope for. And so we're still looking at a prolonged period of softness in the economy. Now that I think is a view that many of my colleagues share. And we have among us former members of the Council of Economic Advisors and chief economists of the IMF and Treasury officials and others. But there are views that are more pessimistic, and some of the great pessimists cannot be totally discounted because their forecasts last year have been more correct than the consensus economists, as the downturn has spiraled much faster downward than many had predicted. But I think we have more information now about the fragility of the banking system and the implication and the transmission mechanisms that have spread the recession around the world. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll see modest growth in 2010 in the United States, and hopefully stronger growth in Korea as the markets continue to as demand continues to recover. One thing we are concerned about is the response in Europe, and that's why the G20 process is so important, and the need to ensure that all of the major trading regions, economic regions, contribute and contribute to the global stimulus that is needed to recover from this deep recession. And China has done quite a bit. The United States has now put in a large amount of money. And other countries as well have committed, Korea as well, have committed substantial resources for recovery. We need to see that in Europe.
박사님이 강의해 주신 부분 중에서 프로스 FTA 업그레이드에 대해서는 상당히 저도 감명 깊게 들었습니다. 그래서 이 업그레이드 되는 사항 중에 아마도 한국과 미국 간의 환경 분야의 협조 분야가 상당히 중요한 이슈가 될 수도 있을 것 같긴 한데요. 그렇다면 미국 자동차 업계 같은 경우 이런 환경 분야에 대한 투자가 어떤 부분이 있으며 차후 한국 자동차 업체든 또 한국 업체든 간에 이런 환경 분야의 협조는 어떤 부분이 있을 거라고 생각되시는지요?
Well, I'm glad we pushed for one last question, because that is a wonderful question to pose. This is an area where I think U.S. and Korean industries can work more cooperatively. Indeed, we're already beginning to see that in the development of new engine technologies. And the LG Chem has been a major developer of new battery technologies. This is one area where working together can boost productivity in both sectors. And this is one of the things I had in mind when I suggested that we should look into ways in which we can work together to boost our global competitiveness of our industries. This is more important for the future. GM and Ford and Chrysler are not going to go back and make a lot of SUVs and go back to the production profile that they had 5 or 10 years ago. They will have to look at a new business model, and one that will have to accommodate the new regulatory environment in which carbon will have a price and will affect the way things are produced, what is produced, and where it's produced. That's why, in essence, climate change is such an overriding challenge for our economies. Because if we want to price carbon, which has been free, we are essentially saying we are going to redistribute wealth, both within countries and between countries. And if we want the major developing countries to participate in this global scheme to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, some of that wealth or technology is going to have to be transferred to them as part of the global bargain. That will change the competitive climate of many industries that have a large carbon footprint, depending on how the schemes are developed and whether you have carbon taxes or whether you have emissions permits or whatever type of regime is established to reduce the level of greenhouse gas emissions. This is new. There are lots of economic issues, there are lots of legal issues, but we're already beginning to see it take place. I was in Canada last summer, and in one of the provinces in Saskatchewan, they are imposing a carbon tax on electric utilities. And that tax is also going to include regulatory mandates that require upgraded facilities that would cost on average about $1 billion for a medium-sized power plant. Well, somebody is going to have to pay for that, even if that cost is amortized over the 20 to 30-year life of the power plant. And it will either be the taxpayer or the shareholder of the electric utility or the consumer of the electricity. And if you're paying more as a consumer of electricity and you're an industry, you're going to be at a disadvantage against competitors on the other side of the border who don't have that carbon tax or added fee. So it's going to create competitiveness challenges that politicians are going to want to address right away to defend their local industries and workers. So this is a huge challenge. And that's why I think climate change was one of the issues that Secretary Clinton talked about in terms of the need for broad cooperation between the United States and Korea and many other countries. But it is also something that individual industries have to think about as they go forward, and probably none more than the auto industry, because transportation has such a big carbon footprint. It's one of the biggest causes of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. The ability to work together in this could yield great benefits or breakthroughs for the auto industry in both countries and give us both a competitive advantage going forward. Depending on the skills of the companies and the researchers and the scientists, and clearly the United States and Korea have a good advantage given the wealth of human resources and expertise that we have in these areas. So I see it as an area of opportunity, and I'm very pleased that you raised that, because it is such a central issue going forward. Thank you.
Concluding remarks. But I think the main thrust of his presentation this morning is like this. Under this very dire economic situation, there is a growing or surfacing protectionism, mostly from the political spectrum, and from the narrowly the interested groups, including the workers or some particular industrial sector. And it is unavoidable, I think. Economic slowdown makes the so-called sensitive sectors, the increasing in every economy. But his main message is like this: the U.S. trade policy and the Obama administration's economic policy calls for the international cooperation as indispensable asset to achieve the objective of U.S. The trade policy in particular and foreign policy in general. So protectionism cannot make contribution to achieving this U.S. objective of U.S. foreign policy. So that's why he's optimistic in the medium or long term that U.S. will opt for not protectionism, but the open trade policy and the international the cooperation, both in the multilateral talks and also the Chorus FTA. So the last thing we need to remember is that the Chorus FTA, although it is now in the low priority in the U.S. Congress, but as U.S. domestic economic issues and particularly the automobile industry's problems are tackled domestically in the U.S., then Chorus FTA will have more chance to be discussed more seriously in the U.S. Congress, and eventually it will be ratified. It will not be, vetoed in the U.S. Congress. He said, he confirmed that Chorus FTA will not be vetoed in the U.S. Congress. Am I right?
It's inconceivable that the Congress would say no.
Okay. So with that very cautious optimism, we can leave this room. Thank you very much.